great deal of financial wisdom, and go ahead and start if you did, and financial insight that God has given us. I'll spend a lot of time here for at least half of the term, identifying probably 50 or more where God addresses that. And then I'll branch out into some of the other passages. We're in Proverbs 3 today. You don't have to turn there, but just kind of stay with me. So that in two separate instances here, 3 and 9, the Lord identifies that we are to honor Him. We are to honor the Lord from our wealth. The word wealth is different than the word income. And as we go through this class, you need to be able to differentiate. Wealth is what you accrue and you amass. Families accrue and amass riches and wealth. It's if you do a balance sheet, it's the positive side of the balance sheet. It's the assets you have against your liabilities. The Lord says, honor the Lord from your wealth. Now, He knows the difference between wealth and income. There's a difference there. We tithe out of our income. We give offerings out of our income. But in this instance, it's a general concept. We honor the Lord out of our wealth and from the first fruits of our produce. Now, there's the income. And so, in an agrarian society, agriculturally oriented, crops harvest once, twice, sometimes 3 times a year, depending upon the number of seasons. I used to bale hay as a kid. In a good year, you could get 4 cuttings. In a bad year, you'd only have 2 cuttings. Your first cutting was always your best. It had your clover and your timothy in it, for those of you that might know something about that. But so we are to honor the Lord from our wealth. It's a greater principle. And from the first fruits of our produce. That's what we earn as wage earners, as diligent hands, as people who are workers. So whether you have a grape vineyard or a fig orchard, now again, I'm going back then, if you apply it today, whatever job you're in, your income, your assets, whatever supplements your life. So the Lord, the expectation is that we are honoring of Him. And He's our provider. He's our Jehovah Jireh. There's a tie in there, but also from the first fruits of the produce. Now, why do we honor Him with our produce? Because it's a reminder to us that He's the one who provided it to us to begin with. Secondarily, if you read enough of the scriptures, you'll find that the earth is the Lord's and everything within it. So anything He dispenses to you is already His to begin with. You're just here to steward it. Every dollar in your pocket right now belongs to Him. He's just lent it to you to steward it. And you need to do it well, because it could very well take it away from you. Parable of the talents. You show yourself good stewards, He's likely to dispense more. So you start tie these things together, you see, oh, God's pretty good with money. He wants me to handle His wealth and be a good manager of it. Go down a couple of verses. How blessed is the man who finds wisdom. Now in this instance, for those of you ladies in here, if you read enough of the scriptures and you go back to the original languages, some of these words are gender neutral. So in this instance, the word man is more individual, more mankind, more the person. So it's not just men, exclusionary of women. God is not prejudicial and exclusionary of women. So don't get that wrong. Remember, in Hebraic languages, they wrote from a male context because they had men as priority over females. This is gender neutral. How blessed is the person who finds wisdom, is how it really reads the original. The person or the man who gains in understanding. Now the connection of verse 14, for its profit is better than silver, its gain is better than fine gold. Now the Lord on several occasions in the Proverbs and the Psalms in several places will identify that the wisdom and knowledge that He has available to us, to you, to dispense to you and I, the wisdom and knowledge that He has available is far greater in value. He values it in His godly economy, in the kingdom economy. He values it much greater than what you and I value as things that have worth. So in this earth, back then, gold and silver were of high value. They made the articles in the temple, the tabernacle, the synagogues were made of fine woods and acacia wood and gold and silver and so copper. And so there was an understanding that those things, those metallic things that they dug out of the ground, mined and ored, had value. God is saying that the wisdom and the knowledge that He dispenses is more valuable than silver and gold. The things that you and I traditionally value the most don't even compare to the things that He has. So we need to go after Him because He has assets that we want to collect. We're in the business of collecting assets. We're in the business of doing business. We want to grow in our worth and our net worth. And in the value of the kingdom, it's wisdom, knowledge. In this case, it's understanding. For its profit is better than the profit of silver. Its gain is better than the gain of fine gold. God said you can go and get all the gold you want in the world, but it's better to have just a little bit of his knowledge and wisdom. It goes so much further in life. Let's stop right here and we'll pray and then we can start. So, Father, we just thank you for bringing us together. We just appreciate you giving us guidance and insight and direction. And Lord, help us to learn, to have knowledge and understanding. Lord, help us to know when and how to use it to operate in wisdom. And Lord, we ask you to dispense that stuff from above so that we receive from you and become and grow into being good money stewards and managers of your resources. Lord, we love you, Jesus. In your name we pray. Amen. So today I'm going to talk about, as an attachment to the monetary system, which I started the other day, I'm going to talk about money and currency and how values are attributed to things, value-laden assets and liabilities, that kind of thing. Before I dive into that, I just want to make one note. I have finished our schedule in Blackboard, so if you go into Blackboard, if you were to look at it right now, which I don't want you to, but if you were to look at it right this second, you see I've got it color-coordinated, color-coded, and you can see when the exams are scheduled. You can see when the one project is assigned, when the one project is due. And as we go through Module 1, what's included in Module 1, Module 2. So right now we're in Module 1. There's just a handful of things we're going to do, which leads into Exam 1 in a few weeks. So the one assignment I'm going to have given you last class period today is to begin reading Chapter 1 of the book. When I get back next week, we'll do a little bit more review of Chapter 1. There are 3 things I'm going to pull out of Chapter 1. So do a cursory read of Chapter 1. Now what the cursory read means is just read through it. Don't study it. Don't take a tremendous amount of notes in it. Just go through it. Really, Chapter 1's an overview. And there's about 3 things that I'm going to micro dive into. And when I do that, those are the 3 things you're responsible for. The rest of the stuff is supplemental. It adds to your learning. It adds to your competencies and your comprehension, but I'm not testing those. So if you're concerned about grades, I'm going to identify what is expected and what's not expected. But for your own growing and learning that sort of stuff, then the entire chapter is. Yes.
With Slingshot, I don't know about everybody else, but they at least gave me the 3rd edition. So
Well, that's fine. 3rd edition and 4th edition are fairly similar. There's not, again, I would identify things that are most important to me in them. So what you find often with newer editions and textbooks is that they upgrade examples, they upgrade languages, they change things, they make it more inclusionary or those kind of things. Seldomly will they move Chapter 1 to be Chapter 6 and Chapter 6 to be Chapter 4 and 14 to be 2. Seldomly will they do that, but most of it, as information and material matures, as research matures, as we advance in not just technologies, but in the way we do things, we have to begin to update those. So yeah, but I'll identify something that is important or isn't important. So I want to talk, I kind of gave you that first PowerPoint, which is just kind of branching into that, the value of a monetary system, which comes out of the bartering system, which is what they used for several thousand years on this earth, is simply that we collected, we worked, we built an estate. I was born into a family, my family was fig farmers, or my family was this, or my family was that back then, and the children would carry on doing that. We built the estate, or the family was known as the clan-based living, and then out of that we could trade what we had for things we needed. So it was just the natural concept of bartering. I was good at doing what I did, whatever my father raised me to do back then, and then we had stuff to trade. And therefore we could go to the marketplace of life, we could go to neighbors, we could go to the bazaars, and we could begin to barter. Eventually the Romans kind of took over, and the Chinese, although they didn't really move into the Near East, the Chinese began to start their own monetary system with printed, or I should say stamped coinage. The Romans did the same. It was a way to honor the Caesars. Remember the Augustus Caesars, lots of Caesars. Caesar was a general name for basically the overlord. But the Caesar would stamp new gold and silver coins in their likeness. It was a way to honor them as the Caesar. It was probably a little more self-absorbed kind of self-promotion, truthfully. So then they would pass those out and use those, but we didn't have a lot of those, so people in the rural settings would come in, and we would have to trade our goods to get some of the Roman coin. So we would go to this guy or a set of guys, and the soldiers would be there, we'd put our grain on a scale, they'd weigh it and say, you get 10 denarii, or 15, whatever it is, drachma. There's all kinds of different currencies depending upon the region. And so we would get that, and then we could use that and dispense that in the marketplace. I could buy cloth, I could buy linen, I could buy eggs, I could buy whatever, using the commerce of the day, the money of the day that was kind of established by the Roman overlords, the Roman overlords. And that lasted for several thousand years, and then society eventually devolved. We went into, if you go back to your sport history, we devolved into the Dark Ages and the Medieval Ages, and really kind of finance was really kind of set back for hundreds of years. And we went back to traditional bartering, which is always a benchmark for most societies. Even when societies crash, Greece crashed about 10 years ago, and they went back to basic bartering. And it's not uncommon. So if we ever had that significant difficulty in this particular country, you would see people go back to bartering. So it might be good for you to store some things that have real value and monetary value, and not just fiat pieces of paper that somebody printed. So eventually we got to a point in society where when the West was formed, when we here in the West, really in the 17 and 1800s, we established colonies, we established communal places of living, we built farms and estates, we had, really we're getting to civilize, to begin to build civilizations and kind of migrate out west. We began to set up, just the same as any other society would, the opportunity for us to begin to trade and to do commerce and do business together. And so again, early on, if you go back into the pre-Little House on the Prairie days, the Ingalls family, if you go before that, they were bartering. And you'll see actually bartering in that. As an example, when Mrs. Ingalls would go to the store, she would take her eggs. And what was the store owner's name? The mean woman and her nice husband that owned the store in Little House on the Prairie. Anybody remember? I can't remember the name offhand, but she would give her eggs, and she would get store credit, and then she could use the store credit to maybe buy some things that they needed, linen or some milk or whatever, and then whoever ran that store, I can't remember the name, but then she might give her a couple of pennies back, or a couple of pence, or whatever the unit of trade was back then. So that was pretty common then, just a form of bartering, and that kind of bartering established. And as we began to kind of formalize as a country, what you see is the bit of a monetary financial system kind of formalizing and caramelizing. Well, back in those days, most of the local regional areas would basically print or mint their own forms of currency to be used. And so I brought some examples of that. So before we ever got to a nationalized currency, we had what was more considered a localized currency. So I'll just pass a couple around to show you. So in the state of Washington, the Bank of Washington issued, this is just one of many examples, not the state, this was out of North Carolina, but this particular bank in this region issued its own paper. And so if you banked with them, you would store goods with them of value, and they would then print and issue the paper, and you could use this in the communities of life in the area. Now, back then, each community had one bank. They didn't have 30 or 40 different banks like we had, so one bank was able to issue fiat currency that was based on its holdings, and if you had holdings in the bank, they could issue some of that, and then you were able to operate in society. So here's another one. My wife's from Augusta, so I bought this years ago at a show. It's a Bank of Augusta. It's a 50-cent note, but again, down in Augusta, Georgia, the Bank of Augusta issued its own fiat currency, and if you banked with them, you could store your stuff with them, and then they would issue you the paper that you could then go into the marketplace of life and society and begin to operate. Well, you can imagine, and I've got dozens of these, you can imagine that every community bank began to issue its own currencies. And here's one from Virginia. This is a pretty nice note. another 50-cent note. Back then, 50 cents was worth a lot of money, so just keep that in mind. And so, what was one of the problems with this was that when you begin to move, or you begin to relocate or attempt to do business in other communities, your note from the Bank of Augusta wouldn't necessarily be accepted in the Washington, North Carolina area or the Greenville, South Carolina area. So there was a problem doing intra and interstate or intra and intercommunity commerce, is that the note you had was good for the regional or localized area and the particular bank you had. But if you had relatives in another area, you couldn't just send them money, or you couldn't go to the next town or the next state and do business because your notes were only localized to that community. So that system, this system only lasted less than 100 years, where local sovereign banks and local sovereign entities kind of created and stamped and monetized their own currencies. And as the financial systems of the West began to evolve, and as we became more prominent, because there was a lot of farmland in the Midwest, and so as people began to migrate, this is even before the gold rushes, where people got rich in the different gold rushes, but when we really started to migrate and begin to utilize the farmlands in the Midwest, you had large landowners really becoming wealthy and then able to employ hundreds and thousands of families and people, which really then kind of made them semi-wealthy. You could give them plots of land, and it was sharecropping. They would farm the 10 acres and they could keep 5 and give 5 back to the plantation owner or the farmland owner, that kind of thing. So not uncommon to what you might see going back hundreds of years, sharecropping or different means and methods of that. But the currencies, as we began to become a little more mobile, the currencies weren't as portable as like we talked about the other day. So eventually what happened was your governing agencies had to step in and begin to kind of formalize a more centralized, federalized form of currency that could be accepted universally in as many communities as possible. And when they did that, they began to print their own it's more of a nationalized currency, and I'll share just a couple examples with you. So one example from the 1800s is, and again, the nickel was worth a lot back then because we've inflated our currency and deflated the value. A nickel is not worth very much today, but it was worth so much that they actually printed a piece of paper for the nickel. And so this is a 5-cent fractional piece of currency that was printed by a federal agency, and this was more widely accepted in the community of life. So if you went to work for somebody in the community, or if you went and dug up gold and you brought it in and they assayed it and they gave you value, they could actually the bank would issue you X amount of currency dollars, and they could break it down fractionally. Now remember, we talked about the value of having fractional currency. That value is really equitable because it allows us to come down to the most minute equity, and then I'm never overpaying for something. So if all I got is just $0, I can't ever pay into the cents or the fractions. You lose on the trade or transaction. But because we're able to break our currency down into the 1 penny, the 5, the nickel, the dime, the quarter, the half dollar, and then larger denominations, it makes it more convenient for us to do what's called fair trade. And fair trade is important because you and I both need to feel like we have mutual assent, we have made good transaction, good bargain. Both of us are getting equal value. If anybody in a deal is not getting equal value, then there's animosity, there's resentment. And so to avoid that, we're able to break down our currencies into fractions. And so you can notice the size of the fractional currencies are smaller. And a couple of the problems with that is, as that one goes around, is 1, it could get torn easily, 2, it could get lost easily, and 3, it could get wrinkled and dispensed of easily. So one of the downsides to smaller currencies, fractional paper currencies, is they're easily lost, easily damaged, not easily replaced. Of course, back then we didn't print paper like we do today. So again, when those printed, they really had value. You had to hold on to them. And if it got damaged and got lost and got torn, it was like a major catastrophe because you didn't just come across those as easily as in years past. The Confederate Army during the war issued its own currencies. So when we went to war in the 1880s, 1860s, during the Civil War, two factions of the United States, the southern states and northern states, each caramelized their own forms of currency. And this one I'm going to spend a little time on, tell a story, and then kind of use it to our advantage. But when the Confederate Army gathered, the soldiers, all soldiers are paid, whether you're a Roman soldier, whether you're a Chinese soldier, you're a Confederate soldier, military soldier. Soldiers in every army need to be paid. One of the reasons why they go to war is that's one way they make money. That's for a lot of men and women. That's how they earn a living back then. It was just men only. But so you can imagine that the military men wanted to be paid, wanted to be fed, wanted to be clothed, just like anybody else in society. So the Confederate soldiers would sign up and go to war and expect to be paid whatever the promise of payment was. They would be paid in Confederate dollars. And for a few years, that really bode well. But you can imagine for a moment when the Confederates lost the war and the U.S. government said you have about 7 days to turn in your Confederate currency or it goes to zero. Those Confederate soldiers who had returned and had a wad full of cash because they'd been paid or they'd been carrying their Confederate money with them. They came back from the war, they lost the war, but they got this big wad of cash and they'll turn it in, and when they turned it in, they didn't get dollar for dollar, they didn't get equitable value. The government couldn't do that, couldn't afford to do that. So even when they turned in, they lost value. But there was a very short window of time to turn those in. Now, what about those soldiers who were wounded and in houses and in the hospital or lamed or maimed, and it took them weeks or months to get healed? And then they came back to civilized life and they had a wad of Confederate currency, and they went to the bank or a financial institution or they went to a storekeeper, and they quickly realized that their wad of cash was worth what? Zero. How do you think that would make them feel in the moment? I just lost my leg, half my ear, half my eye. I've got $50 or $500 in Confederate currencies. I'm ready to buy a house and settle down and find me and it's just paper. And so unfortunately, a lot of Confederate soldiers committed suicide when they quickly realized they were bankrupt and broke. And very unfortunate. One of many examples where a piece of printed paper that has a assigned value on it can actually go to no value in the matter of moments. And that's a good lesson for us here in America, because it did happen to us here in America. That Confederate piece, and I have several of those that I'm passing around, that only has collector value, has no value. If you were to take it to the bank would abscond with it, and then they would sell it to a collector. Has no value, no marketable value, no utility in the marketplace. It's a piece of fiat currency, and fiat currency is legal tender, and legal tender is only as good as it's backed by a government or a governing agency. And that government and that governing agency is default and defunct. And when government and government agencies are default and defunct, the stuff that they say has value goes to zero and becomes valueless. So were there a lot of men that had a lot of money in their pockets that were then suddenly broke and bankrupt? Yes, right here in America, it can happen to you, it can happen to I. We got to be careful. We have to be smarter than the systems. And that's not the only instance in life or society. So fiat currency is legal tender that is printed and prepared and monetized by a federal agency or a government. The issuing government, the government that issues it, is the one that always assigns the value. So let's recognize that there are different forms of value or units of value for things in life. Some things, have value. If you go buy a piece of real estate, a piece of dirt out here, if you own property, and I have owned several commercial and residential properties. I own a couple residential now, but pieces of dirt traditionally around the globe have maintained their value, and generally here in the West they have appreciated in value. Now, if you don't know your accounting terms, an appreciative asset, APP, the appreciation of an asset, grows in value. A depreciative asset is an asset that declines in value. So D is decline, depreciative, and appreciative or appreciation is to grow. So generally, real estate, for the most part here in the West and most part around the world, has always grown in value. It has lots of utility. Now, utility is a great word. Utility means it has not only has a unit of value, but it has a unit of trade or a unit of measure. It has use. So something that has use, it has utility, can be used for something, which is one of the things that contributes to giving it value. So real estate, you can grow things on it. You can build a house. You can build a building and do things with it. So there's lots of things that can be done with real estate, and therefore its value is derived from the fact that it has usability. A car is usable. It takes you from point A to point B, and therefore you're willing to put a lot of money into an automobile because you generally, when you get to be my age and you're working a lot, you got to go places. And so therefore it becomes a valuable asset. You're willing to pay more for it because you need to have it. It functions well and it makes my life function well. So I can't live without an automobile. So I will pay large amounts to have an automobile that stays functionally active. I'll take good care of it because it is a valuable investment. It has a lot of utility. It can take me and lots of people and things from place to place. But this stuff doesn't have very much utility. It's printed as a piece of paper by a governing agency, and its value, it's assigned value. So a piece of gold, here's a piece of gold, which, by the way, you have to dig really long and hard down into the ground to find it. Gold is generally pretty deep. It comes out in ore, has to be refined. So the assayers refine it. There's a refining process. So a lot of labor goes into finding this. A lot of labor goes into mining this. A lot of labor goes into refining this. It's a lot of work, a lot of sweat, and a lot of technology, and a lot of stuff, a lot of expense. So by the time this even gets to a point where somebody can shape it and stamp it and put some cool things on it, there's already a great deal of expense into this. The second thing is with gold and silver, anything that's mined out of the ground or any other kind of forms of mining or other things, for example, there is supply and demand. And we just don't have a large supply of gold in the world right now, or silver, platinum, palladium, uranium, things like that. So all those things that are known as precious elements or precious items or precious metals, for example, they have utility value because they're hard to come by. They have utility value because it costs a lot to get them, and they have intrinsic value because they're rare. It's a rare earth element. You don't have a gold mine in your backyard. You don't have a gold mine in your backyard. You don't have a money tree. You don't have an auto plant. So you don't have the ability to just turn out assets, which therefore makes the supply low and therefore automatically increases the demand. Now, particularly with gold, we'll pass this around. It's just all that is a gold metal. It's 24 karat for those who don't know. Particularly with gold, though, gold can be fashioned into jewelry. There's high demand for jewelry all around the world. Gold can be fashioned into the gold medals, the gold, silver, bronze medals of the Olympics. Have a certain amount of gold and silver and bronze in them. So there's utilized for awards and things like that, but also in all our technologies, in every computer, laptop, phone, tablet, in every piece of solar panel, in every piece of manufacturing tech today, in every space shuttle, and airplane, and automobile, in automobiles, in the new age high-tech automobiles, there's tons of gold and silver in them. You just don't know it. In fact, Tesla and organizations like that are some of the largest buyers of bullion gold and bullion silver because they need it. Google and Microsoft, they need it as they produce their modern day tech and stuff. There's high demand for that, so they have to buy. They buy it in hundreds and thousands of ounces, millions of ounces at a time. The value there, the utility comes that as long as we keep using it, as long as there's demand in the marketplace for the use of a piece of gold or a piece of silver, for example, then these aren't considered fiat currencies that are created by man and only backed by a governing agency. This is actually what's called money today. So gold, silver, real estate, things that have intrinsic value, not assigned value, but intrinsic value and are generally in high demand because there's low supply, they are considered money. So here's a a 10 ounce block of silver, and you can feel the weight, you can almost feel the value there. Now remember, if you study enough history and you go back in the Bible and even extra biblical literature, usually when one society or one kingdom conquered another, they would always rob their treasuries. So anytime a nation conquered Israel, they would go into the temple and take out all the articles from the temple. Why? Because they were made of gold and silver. And they had value. And people knew that. And when Rome would defeat a society, or the society would defeat another kingdom, or the war, they would always go and rob them of their assets. They would generally take their land and take all their growing stuff, take their labor people. They would kill the soldiers but keep all the workers. Because the workers are the ones that work the land, and the land is what produces the goods, the food and the stuff, and you need to have the workers to produce. And so when one kingdom defeated another, they took all their assets and articles, they killed the soldiers, and then they kept the workers to produce for them. And it's just classic. So what you see is that people going back for thousands of years knew what had real value versus what has some fabricated assigned value. Fiat currency only has value as long as the issuing government is stable, there's confidence in it, and they say this has value. So during the 1920s, when Germany was kind of building up its capacity to eventually lead into attempted world dominance in the 30s and 40s. Germany was amassing a large army under Hitler, and they were building a significant war machine. All the factories in the country were absconded, the government enforced to produce the war articles. And so therefore, everybody in the country, do you have a question?
Yeah.
Is that where your hand's up? Yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever seen one of those gold brick things?
Gold, well, so that silver bar that's going around is 10 ounce. I've held 10 ounces of gold before. I don't personally have any of that in my collection because that's significant value, and I like to collect smaller articles. But I've now the ones that you see like on TV or whatever, like what are called kilo bars or 1,000-ounce bars. Those are only issued, bought, and sold in a sovereign, so nations or central banks. So I've never even seen one of those personally. But 10 ounce, I have actually held 10 ounce of gold. Yeah.
You know how much that's worth though?
Well, which one are you asking about?
One of those, like the gold.
Well, the brick, so kilo is 33.3. 1,000 ounce, I mean, it's gold right now is 2,000. It's 1,900 an ounce, 1,800. So if you take 1,800 times 1,000, I forget what that is. 1,800 and add 4 zeros onto it. What's that? 1.8 million or something like that. So yeah, for a 1,000-ounce bar. Yeah. It has a utility and necessity in the marketplace, and we're having a hard time finding it. So values escalate on those items. I could look it up right now and tell you. Let me see the market opened in red today. It's down. The metals are down. Now metals are flat. Gold is at $17.95. Silver's at 23 3/4. And I check those several times every day because I have both equities and hard assets in those. Anyways, let me go back. Thank you for asking. Doug, right? Washington? Yeah. So Germany was converting its country to build the war machine. And under Hitler's regime, his goal was world dominance, as you can imagine. And so, but again, to build the biggest army in the world and supply them with all the stuff, you gotta have money to pay for it. You gotta pay for the metal, and you gotta pay for the fabrication, you gotta pay for the gunpowder and the boots, and you gotta pay the soldiers. And so, as they were amassing their army, this is before they began to go out and conquer, the government was running out of money. And so before Hitler was ever able to go and begin to do what he did, he had to figure out a way to pay on the front end for building and amassing an army. And so what he did is what I've been cautioning against is he inflated the currency to make the military believe they actually had more money than what they really had. And so to do that, here's what he did. The central planners in Germany pulled their currency into their central banks, and they re-stamped larger numbers on the same bills, and then paid people in bills with larger numbers, hoping that that would convince those people that they really had more than what they were worth. Now, it worked for a while, but eventually blew up, and that's one of the things that brought an end to the regime, not the only thing. But so here I have an example, and this is a 1922, this is a 1,000 mark. So the original bill was 1,000 mark. This one was pulled back in by the central bank, and on the back they stamped 1 billion, B with a billion. So this became a 1 billion mark. Now, think about that for a minute. If this had utility and value, usage and value at 1,000 mark, and all they did was just reprinted a new name and a new number on it, did it really increase the value? Did you really have to work that much hard to get that much more? No, the Bible says diligent hands make you wealthy, not inflating currency make you wealthy. I mean, do you trust God or not? I mean, it's really that simple. So, and I'll pass this around. So this is a classic example. And they did that with all their currency. They only had so much paper. Paper, again, was a rare commodity. And so they printed on top of, they just added zeros and tried to convince the soldiers that they were being paid a lot more money. Well, as long as that could circulate in society as more money, but once the retailers started to receive that, what would the retailers do? Jack their prices up. Well, if all the soldiers only had $1,000 in their pocket, the price could be this. But now if all the soldiers walk in and they've all got $1 million bills, I've got to raise my price to this to make it equitable. So what happened was inflating the currency caused an inflation in the entire marketplace, and it was one of the things that destroyed the German society. But this is a real example of that really being done and being just very done. But you try to convince people, and there you go. But again, as long as the government said that was worth $1 billion, supposedly it was worth $1 billion, and for a short period of time it might have circulated as that. But then a dozen eggs might have cost you $5 billion, billion. So you had to have more of those, and so what happens is it just feeds the animal. It's very unfortunate. Remember, that's only as good as the issuing agency. But it has no real utility, it has no real value. Nobody had to work hard to get that. And you may hear me, I'm not really downplaying the notion of fiat currency. You have to have this to do business in society. You have to have this to pay your water and power and gas and light and your phone bill so you have to have income. But how you store wealth and how you retain riches and the values that you assign them and the way you manage your own personal estate and your personal assets and how you approach your income potential going out in the next 4 years, that's what I'm really trying to sharpen you on. So you need to be, again, shrewd, the systems, but yet remain innocent as doves according to before the Lord. Money is different because it has no utility. It's only given a value because it's assigned. Someone said this is worth 1. Now, this piece fluctuates in value based upon supply and demand. These can go up and way up, and they generally don't go down. Now, when I was your age, I started buying silver coins in 1986 when the first American Eagles came out. Silver was $5 an ounce, and I bought rolls of those. And when silver went up to $48 an ounce a couple years ago, I sold rolls of those. Now, factor the growth or the return on investment. If I paid $5 an ounce, let's say I had 100 ounces, and I sold them for $48 an ounce. The difference, the difference is what, about $43 an ounce. So my investment grew $43 an ounce over the 5, which is about an 8, 9, 10-fold return, which is 1,000% return on my investment. Now, the average return in a money market, a mutual fund today is 8 to 10% a year. So over 10 years, it would take to get 100%. Over 100 years, it would take to get 1,000%. It only took me less than 30 years for my Silver Eagles to mature 1,000%, and I turned them in, and then I bought some other things and did some other things with it. And so that's the, this stuff has an ability to go up. It does fluctuate, so all markets have what's known as volatility, that's the ebbs and flows. But that dollar bill will always remain a dollar, but I like to buy assets, and I would encourage you to amass things that, like real estate, that will continuously appreciate and grow. And it's not contained by an issuing government. This is regulated, contained by an issuing government who says what it's worth, and yet on the back end, who will do things to devalue it, because it's in their best interest and not your best interest. Remember, your government doesn't work in your favor, they work in their favor. And I'm not quite sure today who's running our government, to be honest with you, but I knew in the old days, but those old days are gone. So I'm just not sure who's even running it, let alone, we just want to advise you that they don't generally work in your best interests. So it's in your best interest to get smart and sharp about these things, to begin to be your own central banker, your own wealth manager. Don't pay someone else to do what you can learn to do. So this is always going to be created by a government or an entity, and it does have a unit of trade in the marketplace, whether it's in a digit or stuff like that, but it doesn't necessarily have real value. Now, there's a few other things, so you understand the notion of assets. Lots of things can have, as commodities can have assets. Now, for a long time, I used to collect cards, and I used to go to shows and I would buy graded cards, and back when I was younger, the grading of a card system was fairly new, and so then they were very inexpensive. Now, for a number of reasons today, the graded card and card trading hobbies have really escalated, and so a card like this that I might have bought for $10 20 years ago now sells on eBay for $100 or $150. Over the past couple of years, I've been selling a large portion of my graded card collection, really doing well. I sold a Hank Aaron for $1,400 a few months back, and in my notes, I only bought it for like 80 or $100 at a show maybe 10, 15 years ago. So again, a tenfold return on investment, more than tenfold actually. But those kind of numbers, that you would want to invest in that, whatever that is. Again, you have to learn how to manage your assets, but so this is another commodity, and so it has utility. Collectors collect it. Collectors assign value to it. So it is rare. There's only a certain number of graded, this number. So it has a collectible value, and then it has an assigned value based on supply and demand. If people are demanding more of this particular card or this particular individual, the higher grades, and there's fewer of the higher grades, you can imagine that the value is going to be there. So there's lots of things that you can buy that have value, you can buy that increase in value. For a while, my mother collected stamps. She gave me her stamp collection before she passed away. I wouldn't necessarily call it a valuable asset, but they're rare, they're hard to come by. Now, they've maintained their value and increased. Now, they don't escalate tremendously like other things do, but it is another form of commodity. I'm not encouraging any of you to go out and start stamp collecting, but again, the government can never devalue that. The government will never be able to devalue the real estate you have or the different forms of money and riches you have. But they can always devalue paper. Both of these have gone to zero. Any one of these, if you tried to turn them into the marketplace today, they would be confiscated and gone to zero. There's a country, and lots of countries will do this. There's a country by the name of Zimbabwe, and the country's gone bankrupt on no less than 2 occasions. Now they have, most African nations have gold and have other forms of assets in the ground, and so what happens is the governments will confiscate the mines, and then it becomes very difficult. But in this instance, the country of Zimbabwe inflated its currency. I'm holding here a $20 trillion bill that I bought a number of years ago. They added lots of zeros to their currency to try to make people feel like they were wealthy. And it was the only way to keep their economy afloat. They added more zeros for a couple of years, and then the economy crashed because you can't inflate your currency without deflating the entire society. This is worth about $2, even though I can say I'm a 20 trillionaire. I used to do business around the world when I traveled and was on TV a number of occasions, but when I was doing some business down in Brazil, this would have been the 1990s. Down there, the currency down there was the cruzarios. So these are some cruzarios, 500, 100, 200. So as I would go down to Brazil, I would do business, I would exchange my dollars for cruzarios, I'd stay down there, I'd do business, and I'd come back home. I always brought currency back home. And then there was a long period of time where I didn't go down there. The partners I was working with just went away, and so I didn't. But at some point in time, I decided I was going to cash these in, so I went to the bank sometime around 2003 or 2004, not knowing that the Brazilian government had stopped producing the cruzarios and they moved to the Brazilian real. And when they moved to the Brazilian real in the late 1990s, they gave people around the world about 6 months to turn in their cruzarios for real. But at that point in time, I wasn't aware of that. We didn't have the internet, we didn't have real-time information. I just simply wasn't aware of it. This stuff was stuck in a safe somewhere. So I had about $100 worth of value in cruzarios. And because it wasn't turned in and replaced with the real, it became zero. So I lost value on this. I stuck it away in a safe, and I opened the safe up years later, and this had no value. Now remember, one of the things I told you is a good monetary system must maintain its value over the course of time. But when governments decide to make changes, inflate, deflate their currency, change their currency, you can lose on that, and I lost on that one there, unbeknownst to me, unknowingly. So when a society falls, when a government falls, when a nation falls, its currencies lose value. So every time the Romans would conquer another society, if a society had coinage or currency, and when the Germans conquered, when a nation conquers, whatever currency they're transacting in the society loses its value. The new society, the new government confiscates and steals it, and the people become poor. People always lose in those instances. Well, that can also happen with stocks and bonds and other equities that are traded within the markets of the marketplace. So here's an example of someone that owns stock in a gold and silver mine, and when the mine closed down and went bankrupt, the person's shares went to zero. Now that can happen 150 years ago, but that can happen to you today. If you invest in a penny stock or you invest in something and you don't really know much about it and you don't have contact with the people and there's no real valued assets, I've seen people watch their mutual funds and their money markets and their liquid electronic assets go to zero. When we had the housing crash in 2007, 2008, the stock market also crashed or reset. And there was a lot of retired people who lost a lot of their retirement assets. And retired people generally depend on the return, those assets producing a return. And when those assets go way down, lots of people lost a lot of money, and that forced actually some of the older generation to go back into the marketplace, to go back to work, because they lost part of their fortunes, unfortunately. Their fortunes were unfortunately lost. And so when we have market resets like that, even your electronic assets are in jeopardy. And so although I invest in retirement accounts through a couple different agencies, and I manage those personally, if there are problems in those, it's real hard to find a remedy. If somebody was to defraud one of my retirement assets, I can't just go to the police and file a report. It's a little bit different when you have electronic assets. And you don't really have the same kind of control. I mean, it's going to be real hard for somebody to come to my house and find where I store and keep this kind of stuff and steal it from me. And even when they do, I got it insured. So I actually don't care if they steal it. I don't encourage anybody to do that. But my insurance company, minus my deductible, will pay me back. But if somebody defrauds my retirement accounts or my investments like that, it's hard for me to seek remedy. There's no insurance on it. it's real hard to be able to seek recompense, and you won't win on that scenario very often. So, real value is value in an item that has utility, there's supply and demand, it's not guaranteed by a government agency. Excuse me. Assigned value is when somebody just merely assigns the value. So I open the stock market up and I look at it, and I see that the Dow Jones is down 52 points. I see the T. Rowe Price New Horizon Fund is up 60 cents and 0.6%. On that, I see that my Vanguard Extended Market Fund is down 61 cents and 0.32%. And so somebody's assigning those values behind the scenes. Now, it's largely equated to the volumes of people that are buying and selling, the put and the ask and the bid and the sell. And so that's stuff that goes on behind the scenes, which is now all computer generated and algorithm derived. But the truth is, I don't have any influence on that. And so that makes me kind of scared when I invest my own personal hard-earned, diligent asset, money and my stuff, into something that I really don't have a lot of control over. So I don't like to gamble. I'm not a speculator, I'm not a gambler, I'm not really even a trader. I'm an investor. And investors look at long-term options, and I read and study and learn a lot of things, and then I make very stewardly investments. I like to keep things more longer term because I know that there's intrinsic growth and appreciation and value to them. So as I wrap up today, let me see if I have any more to pass around. This one's always, just laugh at this one. I hope you think it's funny, but somebody printed this note and they put the big zero on it, and so maybe they thought this person could bring us zero value, or maybe they thought it was worth zero. I don't know, it's kind of funny. I think I have an alternative to that one. Let's see if I do. Oh yeah, yeah, on the other hand, this one here, somebody thought that was worth a lot. Yeah. So just chuckle at it. Now, let me just stop for a minute. Are there any questions about anything that we talked about today? Hopefully you took a few notes. We got the video. We'll save the video, load it into Blackboard. Everything we do, generally we'll try to have video work with it. Make sure those get passed around. Nolan, you're accountable for all those. If anything's gone, you and I have a problem. Any questions about anything? Make sure you check the schedule in Blackboard and be ready to go for next Tuesday. Unless you hear from me elsewise, have a great day, and I'll see you.